Some nights don't announce themselves. They just arrive, the same as every other night, and you don't realize until later that the worst thing you'll ever live through has already started. The 14th of February, 2019, Aldershot, 3:47 in the morning. There was a 4-minute gap in our patrol route that night, and none of us knew it existed yet. My name is Daniel Hayes. I was a corporal at the time, 29 years old, 6 years into my service. I've been posted to the supply depot on the outskirts of Aldershot for 14 months. It wasn't a glamorous post. It wasn't the kind of place you tell people about at dinner parties. It was a fenced compound, 3 warehouses, an ammunition storage unit, a guardhouse, and about 2 miles of perimeter fence that ran along the back edge of a wooded area. Most of what we did was walk. Walk the fence, check the locks, log the times, drink tea, and walk again. That night, the fog came in early. It started rolling across the gravel yard around 11, and by midnight you couldn't see the warehouse roofs from the guardhouse window. It was the kind of cold that gets into your boots and stays there. Frost on the floodlight poles. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own breath inside your collar. I want to tell you about Jim. Lance Corporal James Whittaker. Everyone called him Jim. He was 31 years old, 9 years into his service, and he was the quietest man on the watch. Not shy, not withdrawn, just quiet in the way that some people are simply quiet, the way certain rivers don't make noise even when they're moving fast. He had a wife called Sarah, who worked as a primary school teacher in a village about 20 minutes from the base. They had one daughter, Evie, who was 4 years old at the time, and who had recently learned to draw smiley faces on every piece of paper she could find. Jim kept one of those drawings folded inside the lining of his patrol cap. He carried a thermos, battered green metal dented on one side, the paint scratched off near the cap. It had been his father's who'd served before him. He filled it with strong tea before every night shift, 2 sugars, a bit of milk. He'd take a sip at the start of his round, screw the lid back on, tuck it under his arm, and walk. The thermos was a joke on the base. Half the lads called it his lucky charm. The other half just called it the kettle. Jim never said much about it. He'd just smile and carry it. I'm telling you about the thermos because it matters later. I didn't know that then. I didn't know any of what was coming. That evening at around 1700, Sergeant Mark Pellew sat at his desk in the guardhouse and made a small change to the patrol schedule. Private Holloway had called in sick, a stomach bug, nothing serious, and Pellew had to rearrange the rotations to cover the gap. He moved one guard from the east fence line to the south. He moved another from the south to the warehouse perimeter. He told himself it would even out. He'd done it dozens of times before. What he didn't catch, what nobody caught, was that the new schedule left a 4-minute window between 2:20 and 2:24 where the east fence line, the section that ran along the woods, had no one watching. 4 minutes. The length of time it takes to boil a kettle. The length of a song on the radio. The length of time it takes a drunk 24-year-old to climb a chain-link fence and disappear into a depot he should never have been able to enter. But none of that had happened yet. At 1700, Pellew put down his pen, signed off the schedule, and went to get a cup of coffee. Jim arrived for his shift at 2100. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. He filled his thermos from the kettle in the mess room. He talked to Sarah on the phone for 6 minutes before stepping outside. She told me months later that he told her he loved her at the end of that call. He always did. But that night, she said, something in his voice had been slightly slower, slightly softer. She didn't think anything of it at the time. You don't with the small things. You only notice them after. The shift began. The fog thickened. The cold deepened. And somewhere out in the dark, miles from anywhere he should have been, a young man called Liam Marsh started walking the wrong way home. Liam Marsh was 24 years old. He worked at a warehouse in Farnborough, stacking pallets and driving a forklift. He'd been at a friend's house that night, drinking. Too much. Far too much. His phone had died at some point in the evening, and by the time he left the party at around 1 in the morning, he was so drunk he couldn't remember which bus stop he needed. He thought he was going home. He thought the road he was walking down led to the housing estate where he lived. It didn't. It led to a B-road that ran past the back of a wooded area, which ran along the back of our depot. He climbed a fence. He didn't know whose fence it was. He thought it was a back garden. He thought he was taking a shortcut. He told the police later, weeks afterwards, that the whole thing felt like a dream. He remembered the cold. He remembered the gravel under his shoes. He remembered thinking the houses on the other side looked weird, like big warehouses, but his brain was so far gone that he just kept walking. He walked past the east fence line at 2:22, 2 minutes into the 4-minute window. By 2:24, when the next guard rotation reached the east section, Liam Marsh was already 300 meters inside a restricted military depot, walking towards the only building with a light on, the ammunition storage unit. But I was in the guardhouse when the radio crackled. It wasn't a panicked call. That's the thing I remember most clearly. Jim's voice came through completely level, almost bored, like he was reporting a fox or a fault in the lighting. Sierra 1 to base, movement at the storage unit, investigating. Private Aisha Brennan was on the radio. She was 22, 6 months out of training, sharp as anything. She replied straight away. Copy Sierra 1. Backup en route, hold position. Copy. That was it. That was the whole exchange. I want you to picture that because it tells you everything about Jim. He didn't know what he was walking towards. He didn't know if it was an animal, a fault, or a man with a weapon. He just walked, thermos under his arm, boots on the gravel, towards the only building on the base that nobody, under any circumstances, was allowed near without authorization. I was already standing up when Aisha turned to me. Her face had gone slightly tight, not panicked, alert. Storage unit, she said. Whitaker's on it. On my way. I grabbed my coat, I grabbed my radio, I started moving. The depot is bigger than it sounds. From the guardhouse to the ammunition storage unit is about 400 meters across uneven gravel. I started running. Aisha was already calling Peller on the internal line. I'm going to tell you what happened in those next 90 seconds the way Jim eventually described it to the inquiry, because I wasn't there for the moment itself. I arrived just after. But Jim's account, given the next morning in a small room with a tape recorder running, was so plain and so precise that it stayed with me word for word ever since. But Jim approached the storage unit from the south side. The fog was thick enough that he couldn't see the door until he was within 20 meters. He saw a figure crouched in front of it, hooded, working at the lock with something. Jim couldn't tell what. The figure hadn't heard him yet. Jim stopped. He set his thermos down on the gravel beside his right boot. He drew his sidearm. He kept it pointed at the ground. He called out just once. Stay where you are. The figure turned. Jim saw a face he didn't recognize. Young, pale, eyes wide, not military, not anyone he'd ever seen before. The man stood up suddenly, swaying on his feet. Jim could smell the alcohol from 3 meters away. Mate, the man said. His voice was slurred. Mate, I'm just trying to get home. Jim didn't move. He didn't shout. He spoke quietly, because that's what you do when someone in front of you might be dangerous and might be terrified at the same time, and you don't yet know which. On the ground, hands behind your head. Liam Marsh didn't go to the ground. He took a step forward. Jim doesn't know, even now, whether that step was aggression or confusion. Drunk people don't move the way sober people do. Their bodies don't go where they think they're sending. Liam took another step, his hand coming up. Jim says it looked like he was reaching out, the way you reach out to steady yourself when you're swaying, and his hand caught the edge of Jim's holster as he stumbled forward. That's when it happened. Jim's sidearm was already drawn, pointed down. Liam's hand closed around the lanyard, then the grip, then his weight came forward and they both went down. Jim's training kicked in instantly. He twisted his wrist away from his own body, kept the muzzle pointed at the concrete wall to his right, and used his left hand to pin Liam's shoulder. Liam, drunk and panicking, squeezed. The round went off, single discharge, into the concrete wall exactly where Jim had pointed it. The sound in the fog was enormous. It echoed across the entire depot. I heard it from 150 meters away, and my legs nearly went out from under me. Jim didn't fire his own weapon. He never even considered it. He told the inquiry in that flat, quiet voice that there was a moment, half a second, maybe less, where his finger was on his own trigger and he could have ended it right there. He didn't. He used his weight, twisted Liam onto his front, got his knee into the small of his back and held him. Just held him. I came around the corner of the storage unit and that's what I saw. Jim, kneeling on the gravel, holding a drunk man face down with one hand, his other hand still on the lanyard of his sidearm. The intruder was sobbing, actually sobbing like a child, saying he just wanted to go home. Jim's thermos was lying on its side near his right boot. I drew my weapon. I covered them both. I shouted into the radio. Sierra 2 on scene. Suspect detained, shots fired, no casualties. Repeat, no casualties. Jim looked up at me. His face was completely calm. He nodded once. That was it. That was all the communication we had in that moment. He nodded, and I knew it was over. But Sergeant Pellu arrived 90 seconds after I did. He came around the corner at a sprint, weapon drawn, and stopped dead when he saw the scene. Jim still kneeling. Liam still sobbing into the gravel, me covering him. The round had left a black scorch mark on the concrete wall behind him about chest height. Pellu saw that mark. I watched his face change. I watched him register in real time what his routing call had nearly caused. He didn't say anything. He just moved. He cuffed Liam himself. He helped Jim to his feet. He kept saying, "Are you all right? Are you all right? Are you all right?" And Jim kept nodding and Pellu wouldn't stop saying it. The medics arrived. The base commander arrived. The military police arrived. The fog was full of headlights and torch beams and voices. Liam was taken away, still sobbing, still apologizing to everyone he passed. He kept saying he thought it was someone's garden. He kept saying he just wanted to go home. Jim sat on the back step of an ambulance. A medic checked him over. He had a graze on his right knee where he'd hit the gravel. Nothing else. Not a scratch. He hadn't spoken since I'd arrived. Not one word. He'd nodded at questions. He'd shaken his head at others. He'd done everything they asked him to do, but he hadn't spoken. After about 20 minutes, he reached down and picked up his thermos. It had rolled about a meter from where he'd set it down. It was still upright. The lid was still on. He unscrewed the cap slowly, looked into it, and took a sip. Still warm, he drank from it. The medic asked him if he was sure he didn't want water. Jim shook his head. He took another sip. He screwed the cap back on. He held the thermos in both hands in his lap, and he stared at the gravel between his boots for a long time. That's the image I can't get out of my head. The fog, the flashing blue lights, the black scorch mark on the concrete wall, and Jim sitting on the back step of an ambulance, holding a battered green thermos in his lap like it was the only thing keeping him in one piece. But the inquiry started the next day. They kept Jim in for 48 hours of debriefing, recorded interviews, statements, walkthroughs of the scene. He answered every question. He never raised his voice. He never made excuses. He never blamed anyone. When they asked him why he hadn't fired his own weapon, he said, and I've read the transcript, he said, I wasn't sure who he was. I needed to be sure. That was the whole answer, 8 words. The inquiry cleared him completely. They commended his restraint. The base commander wrote a personal letter. There was talk of a citation, but Jim asked them not to. He said he didn't want it. He didn't want any of it. He just wanted to go back to work. Liam Marsh was charged with trespass on a prohibited place, assault on a serving soldier, and unlawful discharge of a firearm during the struggle. He pleaded guilty to all 3. He was sentenced to 18 months. The local paper ran a small story about it, 2 columns on page 9, under the headline "Drunk Man Jailed for Fence Climb." No photo, no mention of Jim by name. The Ministry of Defense preferred it that way. And so did Jim. By March, the depot had a new patrol schedule. The 4-minute gap was gone. Pellu had personally rewritten the rotations and triple-checked them. He came to Jim in the mess room one afternoon and tried to apologize. Jim cut him off before he could finish the sentence. He said, "Mark, it wasn't you. It was the night. Leave it." But Pelu couldn't leave it. He transferred out in May. He couldn't look at Jim without seeing the scorch mark on the concrete wall. He told me the night before he left that he'd done the maths 100 times in his head. If Liam had been someone else, if Liam had been armed, if Jim had been a fraction slower with his wrist, he couldn't sleep. He had to go. Jim took the news with the same nod he gave everything. He shook Pelu's hand. He said, "Take care of yourself, mate." And that was that. But here's what nobody saw. What I saw because I worked the same shifts. Jim stopped sleeping properly. I could see it in his face. The skin under his eyes went gray, then darker. He started arriving for shifts 10 minutes earlier than he used to. He'd sit in the mess room with his thermos and stare at the wall. Not reading, not on his phone, just sitting, looking at nothing. He flinched at sounds, not big sounds, small ones. A door closing too hard, a radio crackling, the clink of a spoon in a mug. Tiny flinches, no bigger than a twitch of the shoulder, but I noticed because I was watching for him. He kept carrying the same thermos. He never replaced it. The dent on the side got slightly worse over the months. I don't know how. I never saw him drop it, but he kept filling it with the same tea, 2 sugars, a bit of milk, and walking the same routes. Sarah noticed before any of us did, of course. She told me much later that within a week of the incident, he had started waking up at 3 in the morning. Every night, 3 a.m. exactly. He wouldn't get out of bed. He'd just lie there, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes she'd ask him what he was thinking about. He'd say, "Nothing, just awake." He never told her the full story. He told her there had been an intruder. He told her there had been a struggle. He told her nobody had been hurt. He never told her about the round in the wall. He never told her about the half-second when his finger had been on his own trigger. He never told her that he sometimes dreamed about firing, about what would have happened if he had, about a young man's face, Liam's face, and the things that could have been different by an inch. Sarah asked him once, about 3 months after the incident, if he wanted to talk to someone, a counselor. The base had people for this. Jim said no. He said he was fine. He said he just needed some time. Sarah told me when I saw her at a barbecue that summer that she had cried in the bathroom that night because she could see him drifting away from her and she didn't know how to reach him. Evie noticed too in her own way. She was 4. She didn't have the words, but she started drawing different pictures, less smiley faces, more small figures standing alone. Sarah kept one of them. She showed it to me once. A man in green standing on a gray square holding a green thing in his hand. The green thing was the thermos. Evie called the picture Daddy at Work. But I want to tell you something else because it matters. About 4 months after the incident, the base commander pulled me aside. He asked me how Jim was doing. I told him the truth that Jim was still the best guard on the watch, still completely reliable, still completely composed on duty. But that something behind the eyes had gone quiet in a different way. The commander nodded. He said he'd noticed too. He said, "Hayes, keep an eye on him, quietly. He won't ask for help." Men like that never do. I kept an eye on him. I drank tea with him in the mess room. I asked him about Evie. I asked him about Sarah's school. I never asked him about the night. He never brought it up. There was one moment in July when I thought he might. We were on the same shift, walking the south fence line at about 2 in the morning. It was warm. The fog was gone. The stars were out. We'd stopped for a tea break by the corner post. Jim was holding his thermos with both hands. He took a sip. He looked up at the sky. He said very quietly, "It's mad, isn't it? How fast everything can change." I waited. I didn't say anything. I thought he was going to keep talking. He didn't. He took another sip. He screwed the cap back on. He said, "Come on, let's finish the round." That was the closest he ever came, in my hearing, to talking about it. But it's now 6 years later. I'm writing this in 2026. I left the service in 2022. I run a small business now, fitting kitchens in a town about an hour from Aldershot. I see Jim about twice a year. He's still in. He's still at the depot. He made full corporal in 2021. He's still married to Sarah. Evie is 10 now. She still draws pictures, but they're better drawings, more detail, more color. She wants to be a vet. Jim still carries the same thermos. It's even more battered now. There's a new dent on the bottom. The paint is almost completely gone from the cap. He fills it with the same tea and 2 sugars, a bit of milk, before every night shift. He has never told Sarah the whole story. I know this because she told me last Christmas when we were standing in their kitchen and Jim was in the garden showing Evie something on his phone. Sarah said, very quietly, he still won't talk about that night. Not all of it. I know there's a part of it he's still carrying on his own. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded. She said, do you know what happened? The whole of it. I said, most of it. She said, was it bad? I thought about it. I thought about the fall, the 4-minute gap, the drunk young man who thought he was climbing into someone's garden, the round in the concrete wall, the half-second when Jim could have fired and chose not to, the thermos lying on its side, the nod he gave me when I arrived. I said it could have been the worst thing in the world. He made sure it wasn't. Sarah nodded slowly. She said, he doesn't think he's a hero, does he? I said, no, he really doesn't. She said, he is though. I said, I know. We didn't say anything else. Jim came in from the garden a minute later with Evie on his shoulders. He smiled at us both. He went to the kettle and filled his thermos. He was on a night shift. He kissed Sarah on the forehead. He told Evie to be good. He walked out into the cold with the thermos under his arm. But I want to tell you what I've learned from knowing Jim, because this story doesn't really have an ending. It just has a man who's still walking the same routes, in the same uniform with the same thermos, 6 years on. In the Army, we talk a lot about courage. We talk about it like it's a single moment, a charge, a decision, a line you cross under fire. And sometimes it is. Sometimes courage is loud and fast and over in seconds. Most of the time, it isn't. Most of the time, courage is what happens after the moment. It's the man who goes back to work the next day. It's the man who doesn't fire when he could have, and then has to live with knowing how close it was. It's the man who lies awake at 3 in the morning every night for years and never tells his wife why. It's the man who carries the weight of a 4-minute gap that wasn't his fault and never blames the sergeant who made it and never asks anyone to share the load. Jim could have been a different kind of soldier that night. He could have fired. He'd have been within his rights. The inquiry would have cleared him just as fast. He'd have got the citation he later refused. He'd be a different man now. And a young drunk warehouse worker called Liam Marsh would be dead, and Liam's mother, who I read about in a later news article, who'd raised him on her own, would be visiting a grave instead of prison. Jim chose the harder thing. He chose to be sure. He chose to carry the weight of not knowing for a half-second longer so that he could be certain. And then he chose to carry the weight of that half-second quietly for the rest of his life. That's the part nobody puts on a medal. That's the part nobody writes about in the local paper. That's the part that doesn't make the news. The mistake that night was a 4-minute gap in a patrol route. The intruder was a drunk young man who got further than anyone thought possible by pure dumb luck. The story on paper is small. A single fence climb. A single discharged round. No injuries. 18 months in prison for a man who deserved them but didn't deserve worse. But the real story isn't the mistake. It isn't the intruder. It isn't the round in the wall. The real story is the guard who carried it, who's still carrying it, who will probably carry it until the day he stops walking the fence line for the last time. His name is Lance Corporal James Whittaker. He's a husband and a father and a soldier. He drinks his tea with 2 sugars and a bit of milk. He carries his father's thermos. He's the quietest man on the watch. And the next time you walk past a soldier standing somewhere cold at 3 in the morning in the fog with a thermos under his arm, I want you to remember this. You don't know what he's carrying. You don't know what he chose not to do. You don't know what kept him awake last night. What'll keep him awake tonight? You just see a man on duty. You just see the uniform. The rest of it he carries on his own, quietly, the way the best of them always have. That's the end of the story. There isn't a twist. There isn't a viral video. There isn't a crowd. There's just a man and a thermos and a 4-minute gap in the fog and the weight he's carried ever since. Good night, Jim. Walk safe.